Okay, now we're going to look at the nerves of the posterior triangle of the neck. A major nerve that passes or traverses the posterior triangle of the neck is the spinal accessory nerve, which is here, cranial nerve 11, and it emerges from the posterior border of the sternocleidomastoid along with the cutaneous branches of the cervical plexus. So this is the spinal accessory nerve, and prior to entering the triangle, it innervated the sternocleidomastoid, and then you can see here the trapezius, and the spinal accessory nerve is going to innervate the trapezius. It provides motor innervation to both sternocleidomastoid and trapezius. It is a major or key landmark of the posterior triangle of the neck. The other nerves in the posterior triangle of the neck, well, the nerves that we're going to look at next, are the cutaneous branches from the cervical plexus. The cervical plexus is formed by ventral primary rami of C1 to C4, and it has an anterior part to the plexus that's primarily motor, and that's found within the anterior triangle of the neck, which would be here. Can you see that? So the part that we can see in the posterior triangle of the neck are cutaneous branches, and they all emerge from the posterior border of the sternocleidomastoid in a similar location where the spinal accessory emerges, and this area right here is called the nerve point of the neck. This is the transverse cervical nerve. This is the greater auricular. Another branch, which this dissection doesn't have anymore, would be the lesser occipital, but it would be ascending along the posterior border of the sternocleidomastoid to the area behind the ear. And here's the ear. And then here are the supraclavicular branches. So if we start with the branch that's missing, the lesser occipital, that's formed primarily from C2. It's sometimes C3 can contribute, and it supplies the skin of the neck and scalp posterior superior to the ear. Posterior and superior to the ear. That's the lesser occipital. The greater auricular here, which is formed by C2 and C3, it's headed for the parotid gland, and you can see part of the parotid gland right here. Okay. The temporal mandibular joint would be located about right here. So the greater auricular nerve innervates. If you notice it, it's going to ascend vertically, and it goes across the sternocleidomastoid obliquely to head towards that parotid gland. It's going to innervate the skin over the parotid gland and the sheath of the parotid gland. It's going to innervate the mastoid process, and both surfaces of the auricle extending from the angle of the mandle, which would be about right here, to the mastoid process. So from the angle of the mandible to the mastoid process, so the skin here. So in fact, it is innervating part of the skin of the face, while the rest of the face is innervated by the trigeminal nerve. The transverse cervical nerve, which is here, is innervated or is formed by C2 and C3, and innervates the skin over the anterior triangle of the neck. So even though it's emerging from the posterior border of the sternocleidomastoid within the posterior triangle of the neck, it's going to run traversely or horizontally across the sternocleidomastoid to head for the skin of the anterior triangle of the neck. Okay, last branches are the supraclavicular branches. Supraclavicular branches are formed from C3 and C4, and they're usually at least 3 branches, and they're named medial, intermediate, and lateral. This dissection only has 2, but you can see they're running superficially to the clavicle. Here's the clavicle. Here's the deltoid. This is the acromioclavicular joint right here. Here's the acromioclavicular joint. So you can see that they are superficial. They're not going to deep structures within the posterior triangle of the neck. The book describes them as emerging as a common trunk and then dividing into 3 branches. And it innervates the skin over the clavicle, kind of the anterior or the pectoral region here, and a little bit over the acromioclavicular joint. The book just describes that as innervating the skin of the neck that cross the clavicle and supply the skin over the shoulder. So it's this region here. And they're formed from C3 and C4. Other nerves that you can see in the posterior triangle of the neck are the rami and the trunks of the brachial plexus, and some of the branches that come off those rami and trunks. Why don't you pause it right now, and let me